Hi, my name is Laura and I'm one of the BEMP educators, and I'm here today to talk to you about stormwater science. This is the first video of a three-part series video talking about water and watersheds and pollution, but today we're going to start basic with just some water concepts. Before I get into topic, I would like to briefly introduce my organization, BEMP. BEMP is an acronym that stands for the Bosque Ecosystem Monitoring Program. What is the bosque? Bosque is a type of forest, but it's not any forest. And it's called bosque because it's the word in Spanish for forest. Now, it's not any type of forest because it has to be a forest right next to a river. So, a riparian forest. What about ecosystem? What is an ecosystem? When I think about an ecosystem, I think about things like animals and plants, so something like this. But an ecosystem is way more than that. This is only the biotic part of an ecosystem, but an ecosystem also has an abiotic part, which is very important to allow this living part to survive. So, what do animals and plants need in order to survive? They need things like water, air, sun, soil. All these things are going to be the abiotic factors that will allow life to survive. So all that together makes what is an ecosystem. Then we have monitoring. We can think about synonyms like observing or watching. So when I think about monitoring, I think about something like this. But besides listening and watching, there is another step, very important part of monitoring, which is recording your data so you don't forget about it. And so you can communicate to others the changes you see in this ecosystem that we are monitoring. So I like to think about recording the data for using it later. And then we have program. Program is basically a group of people. In our case, we are a group of people that works with schools, like your school, or with families. We also work with the University of New Mexico, where we send all our data that we collect and that we monitor, and we analyze it and we get some results, and with those results we can inform better different agencies of how the bosque is doing and how to make it better for the future. But today I'm going to mainly focus about our Rio Grande and also the water in general. So let's get started. Let's start thinking about water. And my first question is, have you used water today? And what I would like you to do is to find 5 places around your house that use water or where you can get water from. This is a good chance for you to pause the video and walk around and find these 5 places because you're going to have to write them down in your answer. So let's go. Now that you have walked around your house and you have found different places where you can get water from, you may start wondering, where does this water come from? So here's my next question. Where do you think this water that you have been finding from the different places around your house come from? Take a couple minutes to think about it, and in a minute I will tell you a little bit more about this. So the water that New Mexicans get in their houses come from 2 sources. The first one is the groundwater or aquifer. This is the water that we can find underground. And then there is the Rio Grande River, directly where we get our water from. So New Mexicans get their water from these 2 sources. My next question is, where does this water go after we use it? So here's the question for you. Where do you think this water goes after you use it? The water first goes to the sewer, and after the sewer, it goes to the Rio Grande River. Now, let's stop for a second. There's gotta be some filtering before it gets to the Rio Grande River. So yeah, the water that you use in your house, it goes down the sewer and then it goes through a water treatment plant. So what you can see in here. But there is one type of water that does not go to the water plant before it gets to the Rio Grande River, and that's the storm water. So what I would like you to do next is to think about how does this storm water get into the river in the first place. And to do that, I offer you this map of Albuquerque, and I will link this map into this Edpuzzle so you can see it. And what I want you to do is I want you to find which arroyo, channel, pond, or storm drain or detention basin is the one closest to your house. So you're going to go into this link and you're going to be able to find where your house is located at, and then you can see any of these structures that are built to channelize the water all the way into the Rio Grande. And I'm interested in knowing which one of these structures you are the closest to. So you have looked at the structures that were closer to your house. Maybe it was a storm drain, maybe it was a detention basin, maybe it was an arroyo. And today we're going to continue talking about these concepts and learning more about it. So let's start with a storm drain. What is a storm drain? When you hear the word storm drain, you might think about Pokemon, although today we're not going to be talking about that. When we talk about storm drain and stormwater, we're referring more to something like this. But the definition of what it is an infrastructure that drains any excess of water untreated from storms or floodings into the river or stream. That's what is a storm drain. Let's move on to talk about an arroyo. And again, we're not talking about storm water. In general, when we think about an arroyo, we might think about something like this. Now, that's what I picture when somebody talks to me about an arroyo, but that's in a Spanish word. Now, for stormwater, an arroyo looks more something like this, a concrete structure that channelizes the storm water. So the definition is a concrete structure that channelizes any excess of water in a city. What about detention basin? What is a detention basin? When we talk about detention basins, we can be talking about something like this. It's an excavated area close to a river designated to protect urban areas against flooding by collecting any excess of water for a short period of time. And this structure helps avoid urban runoff and erosion while also filtering pollutants. An example of that in Albuquerque is the Mariposa Basin Park. Now, this is a complicated definition. What I want you to keep in mind is that it is some sort of a structure that is designed to collect this extra water that falls downhill when it rains. Now, there is two words here that are underlined that are a little bit more complex and are important for this lesson. So we're going to talk about it and define them real quick. The first one is, what is runoff? Runoff is any water draining away from a surface. So when I think about runoff, I think about something like this. The other one is erosion. What is erosion? Erosion is the removal of soil material from one place to another. Here is a better example of how erosion happens when it rains and there is water draining down the surface. So as you can see, as the water drains downhill, it kind of pushes some of the soil away and carries it away. And what it ends up happening is that there is kind of this braided area that there is no soil anymore. This braided area is where the erosion has been taken away. So the soil is not there anymore, has been pushed away. So after erosion happens, after there is water flowing downhill, the result of erosion can look something like this. Now, I know I've been explaining to you a lot of different water-related concepts. There's a lot of vocabulary, and you might be a little overwhelmed. You can take a minute to breathe, and I want to let you know that we're almost done, but it's important to get through these concepts before we can continue talking about stormwater. So if you are overwhelmed, take a break, pause the video, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to continue explaining the last concept for today's video. The last concept is watershed. So watershed looks exactly like this picture over here. And the definition is an area of land where all the water that falls on it or that is under it drains to the lowest point. So as you can see in here, we have the highest points of this watershed where they have the tall mountains. And when rain falls, it slowly made its way all the way down to the lowest point. Even under the surface, you can see that the water is also draining to the lowest point. So that's what is a watershed. When we talk about watersheds, I like to think about a bowl, because watershed looks a little bit like a bowl, where the mountains of this bowl are the peaks, which would be also the edges of the bowl. So you can also grab your hands and make a bowl and think about the watershed, a bowl like this. The valley of this bowl is going to be the bottom. So when water falls from the edges of the bowl, it's going to slide inevitably because of gravity all the way to the bottom, which is the valley, where this river or body of water is. So here we have a picture of the high mountains, and as you can see, this structure kind of looks like a bowl, so it keeps like this watershed structure. So when rains, inevitably the rain will slide down this bowl structure all the way to the bottom. So let's talk about an Albuquerque watershed. Here we have a map, and we're thinking about the watershed like the structure like a bowl, and I'm asking to think about what is in the east of Albuquerque that basically limits this bowl, that creates this edge of the bowl that we have in here for the watershed. So which land formation you think that limits Albuquerque's watershed on the east side of it? If you answer the Sandia Mountains or the Manzana Mountains, you are correct. This is like one of the highest points that we have that delimits the watershed that we have in the Albuquerque area. Now, what do we have in the west side of Albuquerque or the Albuquerque area that can limit the water on the west side? So we have El Malpais or the San Mateo Mountains, which are one of the highest points in the west side of our watershed that limit the edge of our watershed. So, do you think that all areas of land are part of watersheds? Do all areas have a highest point and a lowest point where the water basically slides from top to bottom? So this is the New Mexico watershed map to give you a little more of sense that yes, we are all living in a watershed because we all have a high point and a lowest point, and that delimits the watershed edges and the watershed area. In the Albuquerque area, we can see here that we have Santa Fe really close to the edge of our watershed. Then we have Albuquerque is kind of in the middle, and then we have Gallup as a reference in another watershed, which is still part of New Mexico. Then finally Las Cruces, which is all the way down south. So based on that, think that if it rains in places like Gallup, the water is not going to drain all the way to the Rio Grande because basically it's going to go downhill to another watershed, to another river. So the water that falls into Gallup rarely makes it into the Albuquerque area because it would have to go uphill, and that's not how gravity works. But obviously, if it rains in Santa Fe and in Albuquerque, the water is going to make it its way to the lowest point where the Rio Grande is. So based on that, I have a question. How many watersheds do we have in New Mexico? And you can use that map to count how many we have seen today. So here's the end of the video for today. Here's a summary of the concepts that we have talked about. Where do we get our water from? Where does the water go after we use it? And we have talked about stormwater and ways that we can channelize it, and a watershed as a concept. So the definitions, the limits, and how many we have in New Mexico. The vocabulary we have talked about has been aquifer, storm drain, arroyo, detention basin, runoff, erosion, and watershed. These are the main ones. I would like you to write them down into your journal so you don't forget for later, and maybe even start your own definitions for each of these words, because we will be using it in our next sessions. Before the next part of this lesson, I challenge you to go for a walk and look for some of the concepts that we have talked in this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time for the Stormwater Science video number 2. See you.